If Singapore is a nanny state, then I am proud to have fostered one. Lee Kwan Yew. Singapore is the last true city-state left in the world that once had countless city-states, but today, Singapore stands as a singularity in that category. Sure, there is a Vatican City and Monaco, but let's keep it real. Those are amusement parks pretending to be countries. Singapore, unlike them, has its own state-of-the-art military, administration, and diversified economy. I love visiting Vatican City, but given the age demographics, I doubt they'd be able to form a functioning military. Singapore is the exception to those rules, and provides an alternative that may become more important in our more urbanized future. Singapore is located on an island in Southeast Asia in between Malaysia and Indonesia. It is found at the end of the Malayan Peninsula, almost attached to the mainland of Asia across the Singapore Strait, connected to the wider Straits of Malacca, some of the most important waterways for international trade. Technically, there's also a strait in between Singapore and Malaysia, but you get my point. The most densely populated part of the island is in the southern central portion of the main island, with less densely populated areas including national parks across the rest of the island along tiny islets. The island is in a diamond shape with some noticeable elevation, along with some reclaimed land the country has used by using soil from the hills to provide more flat areas around the coast for resettlement. The country is also located in line with the equator, and unlike say Quito in Ecuador, another equatorial city straddling the equator, Singapore has a much more hot, humid climate since it's at a low elevation. This area is where you typically find tropical rainforests. Given that it's pretty much on the equator, well, almost on the equator, the temperature barely changes from month to month. However, precipitation does change due to the monsoon. The location also makes the nation a choke point between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, providing the perfect location for a pit stop or trading post. This is one of the major reasons why Singapore is such an important seaport. Singapore is by and large a product of the modern world. While Southeast Asia did have various complex empires before Europeans arrived, influenced by both Indian and Chinese culture, the island was of minor significance throughout much of history. It had been a relatively minor trading post during the Majapahit Empire, which I'm certainly mispronouncing, in what is now predominantly Indonesia, but the true foundations of this city-state would emerge when the British set up a trading port, establishing a crown colony of Singapore in 1867. After all, the British had already set up and spread out their influence in Malaysia, Hong Kong, India, Australia, and New Zealand, along with various Pacific island nations, so it made sense to have a major trading colony in the relative center of all of this colonialism, for better or for worse. The Indo-Pacific is a oftentimes used term notifying the deep interconnection between these two massive oceans in terms of wildlife and human activity. And no country better exemplifies this bridge between these two mighty oceans than Singapore. The early colonial history would be rather quiet, but in World War II, the island would be invaded by the Japanese Empire, which at this point had declared war against the US via Pearl Harbor, and given the British were allies of the US and enemies of Japan's ally Germany, the Japanese invaded and successfully took over Singapore from the mostly Australian forces who were defending it in a humiliating defeat. When the Axis powers are on the losing side of the war, the British managed to take the island back, and eventually they were merged with nearby British colony of Malaysia. However, due to various squabblings, Singapore broke off and became its own independent nation in 1965. Over the course of a few decades, the islands would become one of the Asian tigers alongside South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. These were relatively small nations, if you could call them, that would become very wealthy over the course of a short period of time. But by combining British institutions with East Asian work ethics, the island would become one of the most important centers of innovation, commerce, maritime trade, aviation, finance, and diplomacy. This is not to say that the transition was smooth. There was plenty of unrest between the predominantly Muslim Malay people native to Southeast Asia and the secular or Buddhist, and to a lesser extent Christian Chinese populations who later settled the land. Chinese people have oftentimes been called the Jews of Southeast Asia, a non-native ethnic group which has faced quite a lot of discrimination but nonetheless has risen to become very wealthy, focusing less on political matters and more on commercial and business matters. This would become a key reason for Singapore breaking off. The most important figure during this time was Lee Kuan Yew, a Cambridge-educated lawyer who became the nation's first prime minister from the late 50s all the way to the 90s. He is in many ways considered to be the George Washington of Singapore. Bill Clinton had considered Lee Kwan Yew to be the 20th century's greatest statesman, or at the very least one of the greatest statesmen. Under his quasi-authoritarian rule, this muddy, swampy island became one of the most powerful cities on the planet, and proportioned to its size, the most powerful country by square kilometer for square kilometer, perhaps only outdone by Vatican City's religious influence. Under his rule, Singapore transformed into one of the richest nations on the planet, focusing on tackling corruption as well as focusing on long-term economic planning that combined government intervention with pro-business policies that in a way breaks the left-right divide that we oftentimes think about in the West. He also tried to downplay ethnic nationalism in favor of a sense of civic nationalism that to this day resides in Singapore. Singapore to this day tends to downplay ethnic, religious, and racial tensions by focusing on integration between various Chinese, Malayan, Indian, and other groups of people, along with various religious groups from Islamic, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, and secular peoples, all who by and large tend to get along in Singapore to this day, despite the hiccups in the past. Lee Kuan Yew was of Hakka descent, who are the Han Chinese ethnic group in Southeast Asia. However, he was far more interested in formulating a sort of maritime or commercial-oriented state rather than one based off of religion or ethnicity. Lee Kuan Yew was also agnostic and didn't hold any strong religious or anti-religious beliefs, preferring that the major religions on the island live in harmony by restricting aggressive conversion between various groups and putting in place various laws restricting the criticism of religion, which has helped reduce religious tension, but at the same time has come under scrutiny for censorship. He also attracted foreign investments from Asian, American, and European megacorporations, particularly in regards to electronics like Hewlett-Packard, General Electric, and others. The government also took a direct role in industry, setting up steel mills needed for the producing of all those skyscrapers, as well as a robust public transit system to avoid the excess reliance on personal cars. And he also played an essential role in setting up Singapore Airlines, making the city a massive aviation hub. Singapore Airlines showed that the tiny island would become not just a major power player when it comes to sea trade, but also trade by air, through major cargo ships, as well as a major passenger hub between Asia, Australia, and beyond. The longest flight to this day is from Singapore to New York. The country has also become one of the 5 most important financial centers of the world, along with New York, London, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. It's also one of the highest standards of living, or has one of the highest standards of living, with low tax rates, and through private foreign investment and state-owned enterprises has become one of the most dynamic economies on the planet. Outside of finance, the country is also a major supporter of electronics, biotech, tourism, and agriculture. In terms of agriculture, it actually produces it via vertical farming. Everything in this compact nation of Singapore has size limitations, but the Singaporeans have managed to defy them. They are so efficient with space that they even managed to squeeze some national parks. This is a country with almost no farmland and nonetheless is food secure. Lee Kuan Yew was in many ways an authoritarian. He admired the civic institutions of the West, but he also believed that the top-down authoritarian mindset of East Asia had merits over the Anglo-American system focusing on freedom. You can come to your own conclusions regarding this as you will, but let's move on. Gender relations were a critical example of Yew's worldview. He promoted women's rights through education, but he was also very interested in making sure that those women got married and formed families with children. To this day, Singapore takes elements of both mindsets. For example, it's very strict when it comes to draconian policies in terms of drug use, but on the other hand, it's fairly lax when it comes to sex work. Again, this is a very complex enigma. Towards the end of the century, Singapore, a nation of technocrats, had managed to combine some of the best elements of state-planned socialism with some of the most prosperous elements of capitalism. Liberal rule of law with authority and restrictions on personal freedom. Rule of law, but without the freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, unless you actually want a government permit to actually protest, strange enough. Foreign relations are also unusual. The country is neutral and maintains its own powerful military with an army, navy, and air force. Given its neutral status, it's not a major target of outside forces. However, it also has to fend for itself and be able to mobilize in the face of external threats that are much larger in terms of landmass and population. To this day, outside of some hiccups, relations between its two main neighbors, Malaysia and Singapore, are relatively friendly. But you never know what could change in the future. Singapore's neutral status has also made it the first bilateral meeting location between the United States and North Korea. And the country oftentimes acts as a main referee between the US and its allies in the Pacific, as well as China and its allies in the Indo-Pacific. Singapore is a country obsessed with its own rules, yet it breaks the rules of nearly every other modern set of statecraft. A functioning state the size of a medium-sized national park. A country that is as much of a product of Asia as it is of Europe. Cutting-edge technology with rigid traditions. Authoritarianism mixed with classical liberalism. A nation with more economic freedom than almost anywhere else under the world. But at the same time, makes it illegal to chew gum due to public hygiene issues. Singapore is an enigma, and as we continue to live in an ever more urbanizing world, we may be seeing more manifestations of Singapore spring up during the course of our lifetimes and beyond. And that's why it's important to learn about this. Thanks for watching.